Night falls over the Shire like a shroud, and the wind carries whispers of ancient dread. In the deepest shadows of Middle-earth, where starlight dares not venture, 9 figures ride forth on steeds as black as the void between worlds. They are the Nazgûl, the ring-wraiths, servants of the Dark Lord Sauron, and they seek a single prize, the One Ring, carried by a hobbit named Frodo Baggins. These spectral hunters possess power enough to break the will of kings, to freeze the blood of warriors, and to hunt their quarry across the breadth of Middle-earth without rest or mercy. Yet when their dark purpose finally brings them face to face with their target, something extraordinary occurs. Time and again, they fail to claim the life of one small hobbit from Bag End. How is this possible? What unseen forces shield Frodo Baggins from the shadow of certain death? To understand this mystery, we must first comprehend the true nature of these 9 Riders of Doom. Long before they became wraiths, the Nazgûl were mortal men, kings and sorcerers of great renown in the Second Age of Middle-earth. Sauron, master of deception, approached each with gifts that seemed too precious to refuse. Rings of power, 9 golden circles that promised dominion over lesser men and eternal life. But these were chains disguised as crowns, and one by one, these mighty rulers fell under the shadow of the One Ring's influence. As centuries passed, their mortal flesh faded, leaving only their spirits bound to Sauron's will, caught between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. These Nazgûl became Sauron's most feared servants, shrouded in black robes that concealed the terrible emptiness where their bodies once were. They radiated an aura of supernatural fear that could paralyze even the bravest warriors, and they possessed abilities that made them nearly unstoppable hunters. They could sense the One Ring across vast distances, track its bearer through any terrain, and move unseen when they chose, existing partially in the wraith world where few could follow. Their very presence brought despair, and their voices carried the weight of ages spent in service to darkness. When Sauron learned that the ring had been found, these 9 became his hounds, sent forth to retrieve what was rightfully his, or so they believed. Against such overwhelming malice stood a most unlikely adversary, Frodo Baggins of Bag End, barely 4 feet tall, with no training in warfare and no experience beyond the borders of his beloved Shire. He was a creature of comfort and contentment, more familiar with second breakfast than second sight, more accustomed to garden parties than great perils. Yet within this unassuming hobbit burned something that even the Nazgûl, in all their terrible power, could not extinguish. It was not merely courage, though Frodo possessed that in abundance when necessity demanded it, but something deeper and more fundamental. It was the flame of innocence that had not yet been corrupted by the great world's shadows, the strength that comes from genuine love for simple, beautiful things, and the kind of stubborn moral fortitude that chooses to do right even when hope seems lost. This contrast between hunter and hunted reveals one of the great themes woven throughout Tolkien's work, that strength does not always announce itself with fanfare, and the mightiest forces in the world are often turned aside by the smallest acts of genuine virtue. Frodo carried within himself not just the ring, but also the accumulated wisdom of generations of hobbits who had learned to find joy in small things and meaning in quiet moments. This foundation would prove more durable than armor, more protective than any sword. Yet Frodo did not face the darkness alone, for he was surrounded by protections, both seen and unseen, woven around him by allies who understood far better than he the magnitude of the peril he faced. Gandalf the Grey had watched over the Shire for decades, and his influence extended far beyond the simple fireworks and pleasant conversation the hobbits associated with his visits. The wizard had prepared contingencies and safeguards, planted seeds of wisdom and courage that would bloom when needed most. From Rivendell came gifts that seemed modest but carried the power of ages, an elven cloak that would turn aside searching eyes, a blade that had once faced the darkness of Angmar and lived to tell the tale. Even the Shire itself offered protection, for it was a land touched by a different kind of magic, the magic of contentment, of lives lived well in harmony with the turning seasons. The Nazgûl, creatures of shadow and malice, found their power somewhat diminished in a realm where genuine happiness had taken root. The very air seemed to resist their presence, and the ancient strength that flowed through the earth beneath green fields and flowering gardens acted as a subtle but persistent barrier against their malevolence. But perhaps most importantly, Frodo carried with him something the Nazgûl had long forgotten. Hope that was not founded on power or dominion, but on the simple belief that good things were worth preserving, even at great cost. This hope would prove to be a light in darkness, visible to allies and painful to enemies, a beacon that would guide him through perils that would have destroyed a lesser soul. The Black Riders advanced like a storm front moving across the peaceful lands east of the Shire, their presence announced by an unnatural chill that seemed to drain warmth from the very air. In Bree, shadows gathered in corners where no shadows should fall, and horses grew restless in their stables, sensing predators that moved on a level deeper than mere physical threat. The innkeeper at the Prancing Pony found himself starting at sounds that weren't quite there, and travellers spoke in hushed tones of dark figures glimpsed on distant roads, riders who seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When the Nazgûl finally drew close to their quarry, their first encounters with Frodo revealed the strange dynamics that would define their entire pursuit. Time and again, the ring-bearer slipped through their grasp by margins so narrow they seemed impossible. A chance meeting with elves whose songs carried power enough to drive back shadow, a moment of instinctive wisdom that led him to avoid the main roads, the intervention of friends and strangers whose courage flared bright enough to give even the Nazgûl pause. Each near capture became instead a narrow escape, and with each failure, the mystery deepened. How could beings of such terrible power be thwarted by coincidence and courage? The truth was that these were not coincidences at all, but the working of forces that operated on principles the Nazgûl could no longer comprehend. They had forgotten what it meant to inspire loyalty rather than fear, to receive aid freely given rather than extracted through terror. Frodo's escapes were made possible by a network of protection that extended far beyond anything visible to eyes accustomed only to seeking weakness and vulnerability. The gifts that accompanied Frodo on his journey were far more than they appeared to mortal sight. The elven cloak woven in Lothlórien carried within its silver-grey fabric the accumulated starlight of ages, making its wearer difficult to perceive for creatures whose vision had been trained to pierce ordinary darkness. Sting, the ancient blade that had once belonged to Bilbo, bore enchantments for Gerdin Gondolin during the First Age, and its very presence caused the Nazgûl discomfort, reminding them of defeats suffered in wars they would rather forget. Most potent of all was the phial of Galadriel, containing the light of Eärendil's star, which held within it illumination from the undying lands themselves. This was no mere trinket, but a fragment of the world as it existed before shadow fell upon it, a reminder of the music of creation that still echoed in the foundations of reality. When Frodo called upon this light in his darkest moments, he was invoking powers that predated Sauron's corruption, drawing upon sources of strength that remained untainted by the long defeat that had characterized much of Middle-earth's history. These protections worked not by hiding Frodo from the Nazgûl's perception, but by surrounding him with influences that reminded the wraiths of what they had lost in their long slavery to the Dark Lord. In the presence of such genuine goodness, their power became uncertain, their purpose clouded by half-remembered dreams of the light they had once known in their mortal lives. The very purity of Frodo's intentions created a kind of interference in their spiritual senses, making it difficult for them to maintain the focus necessary for their dark purposes. Upon the ancient watchtower of Weathertop, under a sky brilliant with pitiless stars, the tension that had been building throughout the long pursuit finally erupted into open confrontation. Here, on the same hill where Gil-galad and Elendil had once stood in council against the darkness, Frodo faced his pursuers with nowhere left to run. The air itself seemed to thicken with malevolence as the nine closed in, their voices rising in a harmony that spoke of despair and endings, their forms looming like shadows cast by some monstrous fire burning just beyond the edge of vision. In that moment of supreme peril, when the Morgul blade descended toward his heart and the Wraith world opened before his ring-enhanced sight like a wound in reality, Frodo discovered resources within himself that he had never suspected. The terror was absolute, the pain excruciating, and yet something in his essential nature refused to surrender. Even as the cursed blade found its mark and began its work of spiritual corruption, Frodo's will remained his own. The Nazgûl, who had broken the spirits of countless warriors and kings, found themselves facing a resistance they could not comprehend. Not the defiance of pride or the stubbornness of desperation, but the quiet strength of someone who simply refused to abandon hope, no matter how dark the hour became. The fire that suddenly blazed around the hilltop was more than mere flame. It was Frodo's courage made manifest, his refusal to submit given physical form. The Nazgûl, creatures of ice and shadow, recoiled not from the heat, but from the purity of will that had called it forth. They had wounded him, yes, but they had not claimed him, and in that failure lay the seed of all their subsequent defeats. The flight that followed Weathertop became a desperate game of hunter, and hunted across the wild lands between the misty mountains and the sea. The Nazgûl pursued with relentless determination, their steeds covering ground at supernatural speed, their cries echoing across valleys and hills like the voices of the damned. Yet Frodo continued to slip away, aided by companions whose courage burned bright enough to hold back the darkness, guided by paths that seemed to open before him as if the land itself conspired to preserve his life. Through the troll shores they fled, where ancient malice stirred in stone and root, but older powers still lingered to offer sanctuary to those who traveled with pure intent. Across the last bridge they passed, where the waters below sang songs of resistance that had first been heard when the foundations of the world were laid. Each mile brought new perils, each dawn revealed the black shapes still following, and yet somehow, impossibly, Frodo remained beyond their reach. The Nazgûl found their certainty eroding with each failed attempt to corner their quarry. They, who had never known defeat in their long service to Sauron, began to experience something almost like doubt. The ring-bearer should have fallen a dozen times over, should have succumbed to fear or despair or simple exhaustion, yet he continued to elude them with an almost supernatural persistence. What they could not understand was that Frodo's survival depended not on his own strength alone, but on the accumulated power of every act of kindness shown to him, every word of encouragement offered by his companions, every moment of beauty glimpsed along the dark road that reminded him why Middle-earth was worth saving. To comprehend why the Nazgûl could not claim Frodo's life, we must look beyond the surface of events to the deeper currents that move through Tolkien's world. In letters written long after the completion of his great work, the professor spoke of providence, not as divine intervention that removes the need for choice and courage, but as the subtle influence that ensures those who strive toward goodness will find the strength they need when they need it most. Frodo's survival was not guaranteed by cosmic mandate, but made possible by the confluence of his own moral courage and the support of those who recognized in him something precious that must be preserved. The Nazgûl represented more than mere physical threat. They were the embodiment of despair made manifest, the voice that whispers in dark moments that resistance is futile and hope is mere delusion. Against such spiritual poison, ordinary weapons were useless, but Frodo carried within himself an antidote they could not neutralize, the unshakable conviction that some things were worth any sacrifice, that love was stronger than fear, and that even the smallest light could hold back the mightiest darkness. This was the power that Tolkien celebrated throughout his work, not the strength of armies or the wisdom of wizards, though these had their place, but the everyday heroism of ordinary people who chose to do right because it was right, regardless of the cost. The Nazgûl, who had long ago traded their humanity for power, could not understand this choice, and their incomprehension became their weakness. When at last Frodo reached the borders of Rivendell, stumbling towards safety, with the Morgul wound burning like fire in his shoulder and the Wraith world pulling at the edges of his vision, the final confrontation played out like a scene from the music of creation itself. Here came Glorfindel, the Elven Lord, whose very presence caused the shadows to recoil, his power drawn from wells of strength that predated the corruption of the world. Here was the river Bruinen, whose waters had been blessed by Elrond himself, responding to his call with a voice like thunder and a current that swept away the darkness. As the black horses and their terrible riders were overwhelmed by the flood, their forms dissolving into mist and shadow before reforming on the far bank, a truth became clear that would echo through all the dark years to come. The Nazgûl had not failed because they lacked power. Their strength was terrible beyond measure. They had not failed because they lacked cunning. Their strategies had been sound and their pursuit relentless. They had failed because there are forces in the world that cannot be overcome by malice alone, no matter how pure or how strong. In that moment of salvation, as Frodo collapsed into healing hands and felt the poison of the Morgul blade being drawn from his wound, the pattern was established that would define the entire War of the Ring. Darkness might triumph for a time, evil might seem overwhelming, but there would always be those who stood against it, and their standing would always matter, even when victory seemed impossible. The ring itself played a complex role in this deadly game of pursuit and evasion. For while it drew the Nazgûl toward their quarry like iron to a lodestone, it also created unexpected interference in their ability to claim him. The One Ring was Sauron's masterpiece, crafted to dominate all other rings of power, and the 9 rings worn by the Nazgûl were no exception. When Frodo wore the ring, he became visible to them in the Wraith world, but he also became something more than merely mortal, touched by the same power that ruled them. This created a strange resonance between hunter and hunted, a connection that sometimes protected even as it exposed. Moreover, the ring responded to the will of its bearer in ways that Sauron had never intended. When Frodo's purpose aligned with genuine goodness, when his desire was not for power, but for protection of what he loved, the ring's influence became unpredictable. It might make him invisible to mortal eyes while simultaneously blazing like a beacon to spiritual sight. Or it might amplify his natural resilience in ways that confounded those who sought to harm him. The ring was a tool of domination, yes, but it was also a magnifier of whatever will drove its user. And Frodo's will was bent toward preservation rather than conquest. This interplay between the ring's power and Frodo's purpose created moments of profound tension where the outcome balanced on the edge of a blade. The Nazgûl could sense their prize, could feel it calling to them across the miles, but when they drew close enough to strike, they found themselves facing not just a hobbit with a ring, but the accumulated weight of every good choice that hobbit had ever made, every act of mercy he had shown, every moment of joy he had shared with others. In the end, the mystery of Frodo's survival reveals one of the deepest truths woven throughout Tolkien's legendarium, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act rightly despite fear's presence. Throughout his long flight from the Shire to Rivendell, Frodo was afraid, terrifyingly, overwhelmingly afraid. He felt the weight of the ring like a chain around his neck, sensed the Nazgûl drawing closer with each passing hour, and knew with perfect clarity that he was overmatched in every conceivable way. Yet he continued to move forward, continued to trust in his companions, continued to hope that somehow, impossible as it seemed, the light would prove stronger than the darkness. This hope was not naive optimism or willful blindness to danger. It was the mature recognition that some things transcend immediate circumstances, that the value of what he carried, not just the ring, but the love for the Shire and all it represented, was worth any risk. When the Nazgûl looked upon Frodo, seeking the despair that would make him easy prey, they found instead a spirit that had chosen its course and would not be turned from it, no matter what terrors arose to block the way. The protection this provided was not magical in any simple sense, though it partook of the same power that moved through all of Tolkien's world, the power of the music of creation, the harmony that underlies all existence and ensures that discord, no matter how loud, cannot ultimately silence the deeper song. Frodo survived because he remained in tune with that music, while the Nazgûl had long since chosen to listen only to the harsh rhythms of their master's will. As we look back across the shadows of that long pursuit, we see not just a hobbit fleeing from wraiths, but a representation of every moment when ordinary people must choose between the easy path and the right path, between surrender and resistance, between hope and despair. The Nazgûl could not kill Frodo because, in the deepest sense that matters, Frodo had already chosen to live, not merely to draw breath and eat food and sleep under stars, but to live in the fullest meaning of the word, embracing both joy and sorrow, love and loss, the burden of choice and the responsibility that comes with it. In a world where darkness often seems ascendant and the forces of corruption appear overwhelming, Frodo's survival offers a different kind of hope. Not the promise that good will always triumph easily, but the assurance that it will always have the chance to triumph, as long as there are those willing to bear the burden and pay the price. The ring went into the fire at Mount Doom, not because Frodo was the strongest or the wisest or the most powerful of all who might have carried it, but because he was willing to try, and in that willingness lay a strength that even the Nazgûl, for all their terrible power, could never overcome. The shadows still lengthen across distant mountains, and the ring's influence continues to ripple through the deep places of the world. But Frodo Baggins lived to see Rivendell because sometimes, when everything else fails, simple decency and stubborn hope prove to be enough. In a cosmos where such miracles remain possible, perhaps there is reason for hope indeed. This chapter ends, but many await. Join us, subscribe for more stories.